with uninteresting characters that ends with an entirely irrelevant quote by André Gide. What made these reviewers so angry? What did bother them so much? And how could this misunderstanding coincide, in fact, with a visible shift in the critical reception leading to an increasing popularity of Leonardo Sciascia in the US? Because when this book is issued and when these terrible reviews are written alongside other beautiful reviews, it's 1977, and Sciascia is about to become a much more known, a much more interviewed, a much more broadly known author in the US. So this is the research question that will guide our investigation of the inexplicable. And you'll tell me if there's a happy ending or not in this case. So Todomodo is for sure the work which challenged more boldly the US-American readership's horizon of expectations, and to my knowledge, alongside Candido, it is the only one which triggered harsh criticism by some reviewers in the US. At the same time, negative reviews sparked a critical debate and occurred at the same time when the first US-American school edition of a book by Sciascia was being published. How so? Oh, thank you. Oh, no. Okay, thank you, didn't realize. Okay. So these stroncature triggered clarifications on Sciascia's, I quote, oblique and obscure writing, which led in a few more years to a broader recognition of a cultural alterity, that of Europe as well as that of Sicily, that Sciascia came to epitomize and represent, becoming a Virgil to US-American readers, just as Gore Vidal stated in his well-known review that was quoted multiple times yesterday. I think that Robin Healy encapsulates rather well the positioning of Sciascia in the US-American literary field. He numbers Sciascia among the respected writers like Giorgio Bassani, Natalia Ginzburg, Maraini Morante, and Cesare Pavese, who, I quote, have been translated and published in both Britain and in the United States with relatively small prints, relatively small print runs, modest sales figures, and the backing of specialized publishers, sometimes of smaller size, which are used to handle critically acclaimed yet less commercially viable writers. So the first account of Sciascia's English works in 2011, I think it was published on Todomodo, recognized a pattern of translations which Gillian Ania, I hope I'm pronouncing her name, Ania, thank you, recognized a pattern of translations which she analyzed decade by decade. Beyond the years separating the Italian from the Anglophone edition of a book, which were at the center of this analysis, we can consider also other factors based on the methodology I developed during my postdoctoral research around the reception of post-war Italian literary works in the United States. If we are to appreciate, to evaluate, and to assess Sciascia's reception in the US, we need to consider questions such as the following ones, like how were Sciascia's US-American publishers positioned in the literary field? How did they present and how did they frame the newly issued books? Was there a rearrangement or something new in the branding or the literary genre of the translated book? And how was the book advertised and reviewed? What is the print run, Healy was telling us, and is the book adopted by book clubs, for example? And are there any reprints in hardbacks or paperback? What paratexts, such as the book cover and its blurb, introduced the reader to the literary texts? and thinking of the creation of meaning around texts. Was the author or was the book mentioned or not in other texts more directly linked with popular or consumer culture? I think the example we had today was exceptional in that sense. Is the author interviewed or quoted? Is he published on the press? And I think Valerio Capozzo's intervention responded to this question with a strong yes. And last but not least, were there school editions, to which we know also the answer is yes. So, trying to keep it short, in fact, we cannot rely solely on the datum of the publication year. In several cases, contacts between the American publisher and Sciascia's literary agents even predated the publication of the Italian volume. This is the case of Mafia Vendetta, later known as The Day of the Owl, which is none other than Sciascia's first book published in the Anglosphere, we should say in the United States. When Leonardo Sciascia started publishing his books, a major shift in transnational publishing was taking place. Italian novels were being translated into English with an increasing pace and at an unprecedented rate, bringing a wealth of fiction to the international Anglophone public. Joint ventures between British and North American publishers had become a regular practice, and so firms on the two shores of the Atlantic Ocean would team to share translation costs and in some cases coordinate promotional efforts. I was asking because of this for the translation costs, because it could be a killing factor for a book, at least a fiction book. So even if the efforts were coordinated, this didn't mean that translated books were bound to have the same fate in the UK and in the US. And translations and new publications of works by Sciascia are exemplary in this sense. The golden years of Sciascia translations and reprints in the UK coincide only partially with his success in the United States. In January 1961, which means 2 months earlier than the publication of Il giorno della civetta, Blanche Wolf-Knopf reached out to Maria Koch, a literary agent and a theater director in New York, asking for a first option on Sciascia's new book. And the letter clarifies that Sciascia was already known in the firm thanks to a previous work, Le favole della dittatura. After some months and to reading feedbacks, the deal is sealed. I should have had a second coffee this morning. So in September 1961, Knopf has obtained the Mafia novel, as it is called in the correspondence, for its stellar catalogue. How was this book presented and understood on the US-American press? Let's stay here. The Mafia theme was, of course, a prominent feature from the book's new title, Mafia Vendetta, to Knopf's advertisements. Here. To Knopf's advertisement. You can see an example here that is actually much smaller than one would think. So, in some way, the novel is presented as an exploration of Sicilian society and mentality. And reviews receive the book positively, but seem a bit bewildered by an explosive potential that they cannot recognize. I will refrain from reading some quotes for the sake of time. We find Herbert Midgang here, that is approaching Sciascia's work from a contrastive perspective. So his appreciative warning that besides being a detective story or an account of a mafia crime, the book is in fact a regional picture of Italy's deep South Island will need to be reiterated time and again on the press. As Sciascia's popularity keeps growing internationally, in fact, new translations published in the US will challenge reviewers as well as general readers. And it would be really interesting to find reading reports actually in the publishing house's archives. The Council of Egypt, published 2 years later by the same Knopf, is welcomed as a book with somber, ironic overtones, as well as an elegant and witty satire with tantalizing moral implications for today. Subsequently, the rights of new Sciascia books are taken on by Harper and Row. Man's Blessing is presented as a fast-moving drama, spicy surprises, realistic background, delicious satire, as well as a sociological detective story. And on one hand, the theme of power emerges, and we find it here in the equal danger advertisement. And on the other hand, critical remarks start to appear in a way that to me seems a symptom of the reader's betrayed horizon of expectations. So, as I said when I introduced our investigation, criticism triggered a series of responses, and I matched some of them here. If Newsday says all of these things about a sense of the silly, the Chicago Tribune explains that the stories are disappointing as conventional mysteries, but they are engrossing as intellectual conundrums. And similarly here. We have criticism from Newsweek, and Herbert Midgang, once again, our gatekeeper, explains what's going on. And something similar happens with Candido as well. So the book sparks a debate in which the positions appear to show clearly, I think, which ones are the ideals against which the book is being measured. Is it mass consumer culture? Is it crime fiction? Or is it the classical European literary tradition? So this acknowledgement of Sciascia's cultural as well as stylistic and even structural difference, I would say, is articulated by a US-American critics, I would say, between the late 70s and the mid-80s. There is this process of rethinking, oh, what does Leonardo Sciascia mean with his books? What is really this book about? And so there are several interventions, which I cannot read all, but we have Herbert Midgang, once again, Peter Prescott, and a very interesting text, I think, by the fiction columnist of the Philadelphia Inquirer, Alida Becker, which I find particularly interesting, as it is about Sciascia's first paperback reprint. So this signals a big expansion in readership, or at least a publisher that is betting on it. So while on one hand, Sciascia is pushed back into the crime genre by the publisher, because we see a Godin double detective as the series of the book, we finally have an introduction guiding the readers, this one by Frank Kermode. And in her review, Becker clearly articulates Sciascia's distinctive characteristics: the lack of a solution, and the center of narration being not action, but dialogue. In the meantime, US-American journals are covering Italian mafia news more extensively. There are assassinations, and often they are quoting Sciascia to explain what the mafia is, or they are hosting his translated articles. We heard a lot from Valerio Capozzo yesterday, and here's just a partial list. So at the same time, a new translational wave had begun. Italo Calvino and Umberto Eco were on the bestseller lists, and Sciascia had become much more than a mafia expert on US-American press. He had become the epitome of Sicily and Mediterranean culture himself. I believe this explains, at least in part, the public change of attitude towards Sciascia, which they understood to be a different and very relevant writer. I wish we could have more time to go over it, but Sciascia starts to be reviewed. It's here on Vogue, for example. other lifestyle journals. And he becomes somehow a personification of Sicily, a personification of the Mediterranean. And so I feel this completes this reassessment that is going on between the late 70s and the mid-80s. Thank you so much for your long attention.
Thank you very much, Julia, for giving us a proof of the American reception of the writer. And so I think now we have a clear picture in mind, thanks to yesterday, thanks to Alessandro's talk, as Sciascia as a character, and now finally Sciascia as an author, loved and discussed even in the United States. So I hope you have many, many questions or observation, or Julia, you have one for yourself? Aspetta il microfono.
Thank you. I think this, for me at least, this Sciascia character that is involved in clarifying what is the genius of Sicilian language and culture was fascinating. And I was wondering if you could tell a bit more about that. What are the aspects that they have Sciascia rectify or revise?
Grazie. So, I think it connects beautifully with what you just showed us, and with this aspect of like Sciascia becoming, I don't want to say a literary celebrity in a way, like a figure that has a meaning on the American stage that makes you connect immediately the name, not just in general with literature, but with a specific cultural dimension, with knowing not just the mafia, but the literary, elegant, acute, sophisticated reading, etc. No? Okay. That said, no, there are two functions of Sciascia, especially in these two great scholars and writers, Mangione and Monreale. They use him very much in scholarship, as an authority to correct, to show. It's almost like, in my reading experience of this stuff, it looks like Sciascia is the real Sicilian author who understands what Sicilianness is. And probably the reason why is that he was so, there are two reasons. One is generational, it's closer to them. But the other is that Racalmuto, we shouldn't never forget, no, it's this transnational place where they met. Like, you know, the fact to me that Monreale was there as a kid, meeting him, and like, Sciascia was never set foot in America, but was in America, was among Americans. Like, there is this. So I think they always say things like, oh, Pirandello writes, as Pirandello says, Sicilianness is this and that, but we should always remember that Pirandello never mentions the transnational Sicilianness, the diaspora, like Sciascia does. So that's usually the one within scholarship. While in literature, in fiction, there is another level, which is like Nardo Pantaleone. So if you are a Sicilian reader in America, you might realize, if you follow this author, he always says Nardo Sciascia, so you might know. But if you are an American not in the know, who just reads this book, which was popular, no? It was read, especially because at that time, no, mafia fiction was a big deal. Do you know that it's Sciascia? You don't know. So he's using this figure to make sense of the genius of the Sicilian language in the fiction, and some readers will be able to recognize, this is Leonardo Sciascia. He's talking about this person. And other readers would just think, he invented an author, probably thinking that it would be that Monreale was depicting himself, because this is a historian and a writer, right? So I love the fact that there are this. It's super interesting to me, our two talks together, no? Because you're working on such a multifaceted archive of actual evidence, no? And I'm working with this other kind of archive, which is texts that have such a different, and the horizons of expectations of the two are so different, but so intertwined. So I'm super excited that we spoke on the same morning.
But probably quoting an author or integrating an author into a writer, into another writer, is a proof of evidence for them. Is still another kind of dialogue, and that's why this session, for example, I started to say is so fresh, that's what we need, because we need to enter the compromise, understand ourselves. That is so difficult to see that's intellectual level, and not just finding for a new interpretation of the old text. Sure, we do have to at the same time, but as we said yesterday night, actually, is exactly our effort should be to see a different perspective and trying to understand how a dialogue can be hidden into the lines. And this is a proof of evidence that will, I think, refresh once again the Italian studies and so what you are doing, because it's archive research or literary research into the text is exactly the same value if we have open eyes to understand how they were communicating to create a third piece of literature. So that's, I think, important. Please.
Curious about two things. One is there is a passage of the Day of the Owl where Bellodi is thinking, and he realized that the Sicilian peasants, practically in their own way, they were felt more free during fascism than with the Republic, because the story goes that during fascism the mafia was somehow, some way, the fascists was against the mafia, instead with the Republic, the mafia. So I would like to know, what was the reaction then in 62 or 64 when the novel came out here on that aspect? I mean, the American freed Sicily, by reality, I mean, with freedom brought back the mafia to power. So was this aspect during the reviews, they catch it or they left it aside? And then the second thing,
I can say very quickly that Italian-American studies in the same age were quoting this passage of the Giulio della Civetta very often to make a sense like, you American readers don't understand this thing, don't forget.
Thank you. So for as far as the literary reviews, I would say instead of a critical reflection about responsibilities, historical responsibilities, there was much more this dimension that Gian-May was mentioning, that of understanding what it is like to be in Sicily and what mafia really is, as opposed to what mafia is in the United States. I don't remember if it was in a slide, but Midgang says, oh, this is the difference between the racket that we know and how oppressive the mafia is in Sicily. And so I would say the main theme is this contrastive appreciation of the difference. Yeah.
The second question is because there is a coincidence. I don't know if it's a coincidence, but Sciascia published the Day of the Owl in the early 60s, and then there is Rosie that comes out with Salvatore Giuliano. They all coming same time in the 60s. And here too, because The Godfather and then the movie late. So it's like these are the kind of golden age of the discovery of mafia, what really it is in literature and movies. So my question is, did you find anything that maybe, if not Puzo or Coppola, were influenced by the work of, in this case, Sciascia or Rosi, about the same theme? Because I find The Godfather not only one of the best movies ever made, as in the cinema as art of cinema, but really in describing what mafia really is, because he does an incredible job.
Thank you. So from my part, I believe that it's very interesting what happens. I focused a little bit I focus more on later years, so let's say later 70s and early 80s. I think in that moment there is this realization on the US American press, oh, the mafia is really big and really powerful and it's killing people, and this judge has died and this other investigator has died. And how much Sciascia's quotes, so the degree in which Sciascia's quotes are embedded in that discourse demonstrate, I think, the influence that he had, or that his voice was present in the discourse around that. I think in order to respond properly to your question, one would need to do a very specific, very accurate work of comparison, because it is always hard to assess how intertextuality works. But definitely I would say, by the very fact that his voice was so often included in the press, this demonstrates how present he was and how part he was of that realization and those dialogues.
No, I completely agree, and I on the scholarly side, I would say that there is a huge literature about Puzo and about specifically this decade and the figure of the gangster. It's a huge chunk of Italian-American studies since then, really, very much. And I would say that the phenomenon is usually read as, there is this mythology of the mafia that comes because of these highly visible products, which are great and do have an effect on the community and the perception of the ethnic perception of Italians in this country and the perception of Italy. But really, we should also read these local writers who are much more, and often they quote Sciascia as one of them, but also non-Sicilian writers that write about. And so, definitely Sciascia acquired in scholarship, and also, I mean, I say scholarship, but it's also books that were trade books that were aimed also at a wider audience of especially Italian Americans who were interested about their origins, they were rediscovering the roots. In all that, Sciascia is an authority to be quoted to see what is real, what is the real situation, what is the difference between our perception of Sicilianness here and Sicilianness there, mafia here and mafia there, for sure.
It's important to distinguish between these two levels. So, from the scholarly, between the scholarly level and the fiction level, but we also need to think. So there are these two levels, but we also need to think that many times Sciascia's books were, and other books in general, foreign books in the US, were promoted as a way of knowing another country. So in some way they're fiction, but in some other way for the US American public, they are a way for understanding another country, which I'm not sure if it would be the same approach of the Italian readership, for example.
Thank you very much. First of all, and mine is not a question, but it is something you might not know. But the attitude of the filmmaker, for the father, the Godfather, is being the same for Damiano Damiani, because when he shot the film The Day of the All, he knew Sciascia. He took the idea from the book of Sciascia first, and second, he took. He came in touch with Sciascia, and then my father was the lawyer who helped him through all the connection and skip the risk involved with the hot topic. So. Usually it's normal that the film director is, aware of the culture of the place. Of course, from a film technical perspective, Damiano Damiani is more typical Italian realistic filmmaker, while the American Coppola is more, how do you say, something like, glorifying, yes, thank you. Is glorifying or making a mythology of what is like mafia in Sicily. I mean, the scene were very mythological like.
I can add something to that. My reading of the function of the Italian-American myth in America is very much that it is a gateway to understand Americanness through a point of view that is other enough that you can think that it is, oh, this is about Sicily, it's not about me. But similar enough because of ethnicity, so almost white, and then white from a certain point on, that you can see the similarity. The Godfather is a book and a film about capitalism, about the American dream. It's not about Sicily. It uses Sicily in a certain way. I think that the disruptive force of something like Mafia Vendetta that then becomes, but even today in 2021, when we go to the bookshop and we see in this lovely NYRB edition with Frank Kermody, that kind of function is at the same time, aha, like this is the real thing. This is not about me at all. This is touristic. And you can see it in the kind of stuff that you showed. Now it's like, you want to know what it was really like? You can read this as a document. It's super interesting to me. What is interesting to me is that then the Italian Americans who are contending with this problem, and if you read 500 Years, La Storia, those kind of books, they are very aware of this. They have been talking about Mario Puzo for 50 years. It's just that we don't read them as Italianists at all. It's a huge divide. And I think they mock the fact that people use Sciascia as evidence that, Puzo is not correct. This is more correct. This claim of authenticity and of accuracy is not the point. It's not really the point. And I think that it's important from the point of view of Italian studies, when we talk about Sicilianness, to take into account popular culture, to take into account reception in a broader sense, and to take account the field of Italian-American studies, which exists, and it is very much kept out of the picture.
Thank you, Alessandro. That's exactly what I had in mind as everybody was talking. And I wonder whether Sciascia became, in a way, scomodo, because effectively he was talking about the constant interpenetration of power in mafia, right? While the American operation with The Godfather is one of distinction, right? It's them and not our system. When I teach The Godfather, when my students tell me this is a movie about family, right? And I say, would you want to be part of that family, right? Because unfortunately, there is a strong ethnicization of a problem which is American, right? And it's about corruption of the system, effectively, right? And the movie is asking much bigger questions about justice, about access to rights, about recognition of individuals that are outside of the system, right? And so I wonder whether all of a sudden, right, listening to you, I'm thinking that Sciascia was bringing in an existential reading, right, that was very frightening. And that's why he had to be exoticized. Right, and at that point it was just a different experience, which, let's face it, we see it every day. I was just reading the article in the New Yorker about Francesco Costa, and it starts with this idea that the moment you get to Italy, you're immediately dealing with lack of law, lack of respect of laws, and it's an other experience. And I'm thinking, in New York right now, you do have policemen who stand next to drug dealers and don't do anything, right? But it has to be a quintessential Italian experience so that you go there. So I think these are very, very interesting aspects of Sciascia and the reception. But I have a quick question, because you kept on thinking of the UK and the United States in terms of reception of Sciascia. Maybe you talked about this yesterday, I apologize. What about India, for example, right? What about places where actually literature circulates in English, right? I don't know if you've discovered something, in your studies.
I hope I can respond in the future, because I submitted a research project about broader Anglosphere. So, because it takes a lot of time to examine the papers that are related to it, just for understanding what is going on in the US, you read many, many texts, and then you go through the archival papers, and then you do the same operation for the UK, and then you need to do that for other contexts. So right now, I cannot tell. I do know that some of the publishing houses that were involved definitely had broad circulation in the dissolving Commonwealth, and so we can imagine that this is happening, but I hope I can respond in the future. And to the point of the very distressing existential reading, there is this element, and then there is the element of a text, for example, like Todo Modo, that continuously refuses to do what you would expect as a reader, because you have no clear understanding of who's the villain, and you don't have a solution. And I think in this way, somehow it's very easy to dismiss the book because it's not a real good detective story, and this is a way, maybe this was a way of protecting oneself from this more problematic part of the reading that then comes out after this more articulated critical reflection of the early 80s.
Yeah, answering to Teresa, I think the other English-speaking country refer to the UK tradition and translation of Sciascia and publishing of Sciascia than the US. You see what I mean? So that's kind of different, because in the US it was different. And adding something to Stefano Vaccare's first question before, I think it's very important, as I tried to say yesterday, to see the censorship, how it reacted to books like Mafia Vendetta in this case, and so the dossier by the FBI that was open here in 1964. Because as we know, more the censorship is strong, more the value of literature is high, you know what I mean? And so that's what they did, actually, because Mafia Vendetta obviously wasn't very well accepted since American Mafia was growing so much. Then they decided to approve Mafia Vendetta because it wasn't the same kind of stuff that was happening here, and so they allowed the publication of it. So I think to understand better the reception, we had to go to the invisible war of repression that in 60s were happening here and 70s were happening in Italy in a way. So those are other kind of angles that we are exploring, and I think they are crucial to understand really not just the happy reception of an author, but the real one from a state that was publishing or not the authors. Joe?
First of all, I apologize for missing this section. I'd intended to be here. I got badly lost on the New York subway. I have been in parts of the city which very few European tourists will actually visit. I apologize. But I heard the name Mario Puzo being mentioned, and I'd like to say something about that. I've just published an article on Puzo and The Godfather in an American journal, Humanities, published in Washington by NAD. This was based on an interview which I did across the Atlantic with Puzo himself 25, 30 years ago, I can't remember. Just a couple of things. First of all, he knew nothing about Sicily. I mean, he was of Neapolitan origin, as he admitted. He had been to Sicily, and he walked about, he told me, I'm quoting, in a state of terror. He thought that he would be recognized by mafiosi who would actually hate him and